How does a man face the final sunrise of his life when he knows it will be his last? Not because of fate, not because of illness, but because the state of Texas has scheduled the exact hour they intend to end his existence. Christopher Young feels every second tightening around him. It is July 16, 2018, and Christopher lies awake in his narrow cell, staring at the cracked ceiling as memories collide with the reality he can no longer escape. He is not the reckless 21-year-old from the past. He is a man remade, yet condemned all the same. For more than a decade, he has mentored younger inmates, calmed tensions, embraced faith, and rebuilt the pieces of the life he once shattered. But transformation carries no weight here. Time on death row does not measure growth. It measures endings, and Christopher feels that ending pressing closer with every breath. Hours earlier, he stood before the Texas Parole Board. He did not beg. He challenged. He argued that justice had been uneven, that mercy had been granted to men whose crimes eclipsed his own. He reminded them he had changed, that he had become a father, a guide, a man willing to face his past. He spoke of his daughters, 3 young girls who still needed a father, even if only through letters and glass. He spoke of the steps he had taken to rise above the boy the system once labeled hopeless. But the board offered no opening, no hesitation, only the familiar, brutal certainty of denial. Now, as the prison settles into its nighttime silence, Christopher prepares for a fate he can feel in the pit of his stomach. Change came, but too late for a system that judges the past more loudly than the present. The walls do not care who he has become. They remember only who he was. Welcome to Court of Secrets, where we uncover the stories that haunt America and reveal the hidden truths behind the condemned. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share. The night of November 21, 2004, did not look like the kind of night that would change the course of so many lives. It started the way countless nights in San Antonio begin, with the last customers stepping out of small family shops and convenience stores, the streets settling under yellow streetlights, and the final bits of daylight slipping away without resistance. Inside one of those small stores, a father and husband named Hasmukh Patel was finishing another long shift, straightening the counter, counting the drawer, and preparing to lock the door the way he had done thousands of times before. He had come to America chasing opportunity, believing that hard work could build something for his children that he had never been given. He had survived illness, poverty, and migration, but he would not survive what was coming next. Across town, a much younger man was spiraling under the weight of his own history. Christopher Young was 21, a father himself, but trapped inside a world shaped by violence, addiction, and unresolved anger. He was the kind of young man people judged before he even spoke, the kind shaped by neighborhoods where kids found gangs faster than guidance and where poverty wasn't a temporary struggle but a permanent shadow. His childhood had been fractured in ways he never learned to articulate. He lost people early. He trusted no one. He battled addictions long before his mind was fully formed. He carried wounds from a childhood that never gave him the space to heal. But none of this would matter once he crossed the threshold of Patel's store. The moment he stepped inside, everything that came before him and everything that would come after him slammed together in one catastrophic intersection. Witnesses would later describe how quickly it all happened. The door opened, a burst of cold air swept in, and Christopher demanded alcohol. When Patel refused because he appeared intoxicated, the argument escalated in seconds. Fear hardened the air. Patel moved to protect himself, protect his business, protect his life. Christopher, fueled by rage and alcohol, reached for a gun that should never have been in his hands. The shot came fast, too fast for Patel to move. A single bullet tore through the quiet of the shop and through the future Patel had worked so tirelessly to build. He collapsed behind the counter, struggling to breathe, and in those final seconds, the life of a hard-working father ended at the hands of a young man who barely understood the consequences of what he had done. Christopher fled. Panic pushed him into the night, but the weight of what happened didn't disappear. It followed him. Police built their case quickly. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and Christopher's own unraveling guilt led investigators straight to him. When officers finally confronted him, he didn't fight. He didn't run. The moment they placed him in handcuffs, something inside him seemed to break, as if the reality of what he had done finally made its way through the layers of anger that had consumed him for years. The Patel family could not understand how a son, husband, and father could be taken so suddenly, so violently. There was no warning, no last moments, no chance for goodbyes. They were left with a grief that stretched across years, consuming every holiday, every family gathering, every attempt at normalcy. They were a family that came to America to build something better, and in an instant, the foundation of that dream collapsed. Christopher's own family had their grief, though of a different kind. They watched a son they loved fall deeper into a world he wasn't prepared to survive. They saw the damage trauma had done to him long before he ever picked up a gun. They knew the boy he once was. They knew the man he was trying to become, even if he had failed. His mother would sit in court holding photographs of him as a child, pictures of a boy with bright eyes before the world hardened him. But none of that mattered in the courtroom. When the trial began, the prosecution painted Christopher as a violent criminal who acted without remorse. They focused on the shot fired, the life taken, the devastation left behind. They emphasized his past, his gang affiliation, his addictions, and his unstable history. They told the jury that this was not an accident but a choice, a decision fueled by recklessness and cruelty. It didn't matter that he was young. It didn't matter that he had lived a life without guidance. What mattered was that a man was dead and a family was destroyed. The defense tried to tell a different story. They talked about Christopher's upbringing, about the cycles of violence that had shaped him. They described a boy who never stood a chance, a young man who made a terrible, irreversible decision but who wasn't beyond redemption. They pleaded for the jury to see a human being instead of a headline. They asked them to consider life without parole instead of death. But the jury didn't move. They couldn't look past the tragic image of Patel in his final seconds. They couldn't look past the grief of his family. In a state known for its harsh punishments, especially in capital cases, the outcome felt almost inevitable. When the jury returned with the sentencing decision, Christopher stared straight ahead. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He didn't break down. The words death penalty were spoken with the kind of calm that makes them even more chilling. In that moment, Christopher's life split into two parts: the life before the shooting and the life after the sentence. One was a chaotic storm of mistakes and trauma. The other would unfold in a concrete cell under constant watch, with the shadow of an execution date hovering over him like a relentless second sun. But what no one expected was what happened next. Over the years that followed, Christopher changed in ways few people believed possible. The angry young man hardened by the streets began to soften. He started reading, learning, and writing. He began reflecting instead of reacting. He mentored younger inmates, helped them stay out of gangs, and intervened in violence anytime he could. Guards noticed. Other inmates noticed. Counselors noticed. Christopher wasn't the same boy who had walked into Patel's store that night. Prison, in a strange and tragic way, had become the first place where he ever experienced stability, structure, and time to face the truth of who he was. But the system does not measure transformation. It measures the crime. Years passed, and the man who once lashed out at the world was now someone who spent every day trying to make amends in the only way he could. He wrote letters to young people caught in the same cycles he once lived through. He spoke to them about responsibility, consequences, and the lies that violence tells you when you're too angry to see clearly. He didn't try to excuse what he had done. He didn't hide behind excuses. He accepted the weight of his actions, even when that weight threatened to crush him. Inside a place where most men hardened, he softened. Inside a place where rage simmered at every corner, he learned patience. Inside a place meant to break him, he rebuilt himself piece by piece. But even as he changed, his sentence did not. Death row is not just a physical place. It is a psychological one. Inmates live in a world where the future is measured not in years, but in appeals, court dates, and the unspoken countdown to a day none of them want to acknowledge. Every knock on the cell door could bring news that moves that day either closer or further away. Every new attorney, every new filing, every rejected appeal is another reminder that the system rarely bends. Even when the person at its center has. Christopher's daughters grew up with their father behind bars. They saw him through thick glass, through short visits, through letters that tried to explain a world they were too young to understand. He tried to give them what he could: lessons, love, hope, and apologies that ran deeper than the pages he wrote on. They grew older, and with age came an understanding of what their father had done, yet they still chose to love him. They saw the man he had become, not the one he once was. But love from inside a prison is always limited, always interrupted, always under surveillance. And no amount of change within those walls could undo the loss the Patel family suffered. When the clemency process began, Christopher believed that this might be his one chance to show that growth mattered. He spoke openly about the years he spent addressing his trauma, mentoring younger inmates, and changing the course of lives that could have ended the same way his nearly did. He didn't dismiss the pain he caused. He didn't diminish Patel's life. He simply asked for the opportunity to live out his own life in prison, to continue the work he had started, even if freedom was something he would never experience again. But clemency in Texas is a rare form of mercy. The board had denied countless petitions, often without explanation. Christopher's legal team pointed out an undeniable disparity. Just months earlier, a white man named Thomas Whitaker, who had been convicted of murdering nearly his entire family, had his death sentence commuted to life in prison. Whitaker's crime was brutal, calculated, and far more extensive. Yet the board found room for mercy. They looked at his transformation and deemed it meaningful enough to spare his life. Christopher hoped they would look at him the same way. He hoped that the work he had done in prison would matter. He hoped that the years he spent rebuilding himself would mean something. But when he stood before the board, he saw the decision forming in their eyes long before they spoke. They listened, but they did not hear. His arguments about racial bias, about uneven justice, about the worth of a changed man, drifted into a room that had already made up its mind. He spoke for his daughters, for the possibility of a future shaped by good instead of past mistakes. But the board remained unmoved. When the denial came, it hit harder than the sentence itself. Hope has a way of softening even the harshest reality, but once hope is taken away, all that remains is the cold certainty of the end. Christopher returned to his cell knowing that the countdown was no longer abstract. The date was set. The process had begun. There were no more appeals to file, no more delays to hope for, no more administrative steps to cling to. The end was coming, and coming quickly on the night before his execution. Christopher sat awake in his cell, unable to quiet the thoughts rushing through his mind. He thought about Patel, about the life he had taken, about the family whose grief stretched across every year since that night. He thought about his own daughters, about how their lives would continue without him, about how they would remember him once he was gone. He thought about the boy he once was, the angry, lost child who had grown up without guidance, without a stable home, without the tools to navigate a world that consumed him too early. And he thought about the man he had become, the one who spent years trying to undo what could never be undone. The officers came for him early in the evening. The atmosphere in the unit shifted into something heavy, something tense, something final. Men on death row know the routine. They feel it in the silence. They feel it in the footsteps. They feel it in the way officers move with practiced solemnity. Christopher walked out of his cell in restraints, passing men who had shared the same air, the same fears, the same long nights of waiting. Some whispered prayers. Some called out his name. Some simply stood in silence. In a place where death is a scheduled event, solidarity becomes its own kind of courage. The walk to the chamber is short, but it feels endless. The world becomes smaller with each step. The lights are harsh. The air is cold. Every movement feels magnified, as if the mind is trying to record the last fragments of a world it knows it won't see again. When Christopher entered the chamber, he saw the witnesses behind the glass. Members of Patel's family sat on one side, carrying a grief that time could not erase. On the other side were Christopher's loved ones, watching a son, a brother, a father take his final breaths through a barrier that kept them from holding him, from comforting him, from offering anything more than silent tears. Christopher lay on the gurney. The straps tightened across his arms and legs. The needle found its place. The room fell into an unnatural stillness, the kind that marks a moment when time itself seems to pause. The warden asked if he had any final words. Christopher spoke through a voice that trembled but did not break. He apologized to the Patel family. He apologized to his own. He spoke about change, about responsibility, about the possibility of becoming better even in the darkest places. He told his daughters he loved them, that he hoped they would grow into strong women who would break the cycles that shaped his life. And he said he was ready, not because he wanted to die, but because he had learned to accept the consequences of the night that destroyed two families forever. As the drugs entered his system, Christopher's breathing slowed. His eyes grew heavy. The world blurred at the edges. And in those final moments, he wasn't the 21-year-old who fired the shot. He wasn't the inmate who spent years mentoring others. He was simply a man facing the end, carrying a lifetime of regrets and a sliver of peace he had fought hard to earn. At 6:39 p.m., the warden declared the sentence carried out. 2 families left the prison that night. One carried a wound that would never fully heal. The other carried the loss of a man who had changed too late for a system that rarely forgives. And somewhere in the quiet spaces where grief meets reflection, the story of what happened that night in 2004 continues to echo, reminding anyone who listens that tragedy does not end with a verdict. It lives on in every life it touches. Christopher Young's life is a reminder of how thin the line can be between who someone is and who they might have become. He was a child shaped by grief, a teenager searching for belonging in all the wrong places, and a young man whose pain erupted in a single irreversible moment. His actions shattered a family, and the justice system answered with a finality that left his own daughters carrying a loss they never chose. The tragedy lies not only in the life he took but in the years afterward, where change grew quietly inside a man the world had already condemned. He became a mentor, a voice of caution, a father trying to make amends from behind concrete walls. Yet in a system built on retribution, redemption often arrives too late to matter. His story is a reflection of cycles, of violence, of punishment, of consequences that echo far beyond the moment they begin. In the end, both families walked away with wounds time can't repair.